You're on.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for joining us today on ACSA's third webinar series as part of the Mobility in California. My name is Martha Alvarez, and I'm an activist with Advocate. As you know, the ESSA, Every Student is a Good Act, was signed into law by President Obama December 10 of 2016. There's a lot of work happening both in California and at the federal level, thinking about how to implement the new autonomous system and how to implement new assessment standards and implementation of education programs. We're very pleased today to have ACSA two federal advocates speak about the work happening at the federal level with implementation of ESSA. There's pending regulations that we want to get more information in the coming months and what it means for you, school districts, and leaders of California. We'll also have someone from the Department of Education talk about what California is doing regarding the state plan that was talking about implementation of the new federal law. We want this to be an interactive webinar, so please use the chat box that we can answer your questions and receive your comments as well. If you have any outstanding questions or any clarification, especially from the Department of Education, we want to hear from you. If we're unable to answer the questions today, we'll follow up after the webinar with information as well. And today is an opportunity for you to get those questions answered. We want to hear comments from you as well. And there'll be a few questions for you to keep in mind. The webinar recording will be available on Thursday, October 20th. If you want to take a look at the information afterwards as well. So with that, we'll get started. We'll be covering three parts today. So first, we'll have our two federal advocates, Amy Sosinski and Greg Schleitke, talk about the federal ESSA requirements, provide some highlights of what the new law says. Amy and Greg together have over 40 years of advocacy at the federal level. They have been partnering with ACSA over the last 2 years. Part of our advocacy plan at the federal level is to increase our visibility, as well as the Autonomous Workforce Association. Amy and Rush will be doing the first part of the webinar, and then we'll be going on to the second portion with Barbara Martinson from the Department of Education. Barbara has been the ESSA state lead since earlier this year when the Stakeholder of Education appointed her for this position. She and her colleagues have been leading a lot of workshops throughout the state trying to increase and promote stakeholder engagement. So they will full of information and a lot of insight that we have described to you during this 1-hour webinar. So with that, we'll pass it on to Rush and Amy, who are in DC and will be joining us via the webinar.
This is Amy Starzynski. Thank you for having us join you today. I will start us off with an overview of ESSA, highlighting important things for state and district leaders to know, particularly with a focus on district leaders, and including some of the big changes, the big shifts that have been provided for in the law. So I'll get us started on a kind of title-by-title overview of the key provisions, and then we'll hand off to my colleague, Greg Schleitke, to pick up on a few of the later titles in the Act, as well as then to talk about where the department is in implementation of the new law, both in terms of regulations and guidance and the timeline we expect to play out over the next year or so. And then we'll also touch quickly on state plan development. You will have an opportunity to ask questions as we go, and we'll be monitoring those in the text and chat box, and we'll try to answer those as time permits. So in the interest of time, we've got a lot of ground to cover and a little bit of a window to do that. So I'm not going to do any more introductions, and we'll just dive right in. So ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, was enacted just short of a year ago. It was passed by both the House and Senate with strong bipartisan support and signed into law by President Obama on December 10th of last year. It's now Public Law 14-95, and it completely replaces the No Child Left Behind Act, which is, you all are well familiar with, long overdue for revision. An important note just on the structure and content of the law. So as you look at just kind of the table of contents and the way the law is laid out, on the surface it looks like very little change. You know, Title I is still the core act of the law, dealing with the basic programs and providing additional supplemental funding for schools serving high-need students. Title II addresses teacher development, but also principals and other school leaders. Title III is still the act dealing with language instruction for English learners, and on in that regard. But we'll shift now and really talk through title by title some of those big issues that you might want to be aware of. So starting with Title I, again, this is the core title for all of the supplemental funding for the needs of students. With regard to state standards, Title I still requires states to provide an assurance that they've adopted challenging academic content standards and aligned academic achievement standards. Those academic achievement standards have to define at least or not less than 3 levels of achievement that students may attain in math, reading or language arts, and science. So no big shifts in that regard. But the law has established a new bar, and these really are to be college and career-ready standards. And to that end, state standards must be aligned with entrance requirements for credit-bearing coursework in higher education, as well as state career and technical education standards. Title I also makes big changes with regard to accountability, and there's several elements of that I'm going to touch on. The first being the goals for student performance. And those of you who have been living under No Child Left Behind will probably be relieved to know, or have been relieved to know, that ESSA completely eliminates the AMO requirement established in No Child Left Behind, the annual measurable objective. That ambitious and largely unattainable goal of having 100% of students proficient by the 2013-14 school year. Instead, states, and each individual state is going to be required to set its own long-term goals and measures of interim progress. And they must have goals in at least academic achievement, so those are the annual assessments. Must have goals and targets for high school graduation rate based on the 4-year adjusted cohort rate, but states may optionally use also an extended cohort rate. And then they must also have under Title I, and this is a big change, state targets for improvement in English language proficiency by English language learners. And we'll touch on this further, but in No Child Left Behind, the goals and proficiency targets for English language learners achieving English language proficiency were addressed only in Title III. Now they're moved up to Title I and are a core component of Title I accountability. These goals, the state set, must use the same multi-year lengths of time for all students, so you've got to raise those interim targets over the same course of time. But the increments of progress don't have to be the same. In fact, states are required to take into account the subgroup improvement needed to close achievement gaps. I've mentioned assessments, so with regard to assessments, and these are in particular the statewide kind of summative assessments used for accountability, there hasn't been an awful lot of changes here. In fact, it was an area where I think Congress was entertaining changes and certainly heard from the field and advocates and others that the No Child Left Behind testing scheme was had grown out of proportion. At the end of the day, though, they left No Child Left Behind testing requirements essentially in place. States have to have and use statewide assessments for all schools in reading and math, annually in grades 3 through 8 and at least once in the high school grades. And there must also be a statewide science assessment administered at least once in each of the 3 grade stands. So that hasn't changed from the prior law. These assessments, though, do have to include measures of higher order thinking and understanding. And in lieu of a statewide summative assessment, states are permitted to use multiple interim assessments throughout the school year, though they have to be able to be combined into a summative type score that factors into accountability. States may use portfolios, projects, extended performance tasks, computer-adapted tests are also permitted, at least for part of the statewide assessment system. And there are a couple of interesting provisions that would allow additional flexibility. So some states under No Child Left Behind waivers were allowed to get an exemption or a waiver so that students in the 8th grade who were taking advanced math courses could take that high school level corresponding end-of-course assessment in lieu of the 8th grade test. So students in 8th grade taking advanced math aren't double tested. That is now fully allowed within the provisions of ESSA. ESSA also allows districts to use at the high school level locally selected assessments in lieu of state-designated high school tests. But they must be nationally recognized assessments, and each state on a state-by-state basis would have to approve the use of those locally selected assessments. And again, those are just at the high school level. The 1% cap on the administration of alternative assessments for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities remains. But again, worth noting that the cap at the state level on students participating in those assessments, not a cap to be imposed at the district level. And so that's an issue that probably we could spend another hour talking about if we had it. But let me just note for now that that cap is still largely in place as it was. And then there are also a couple of other interesting innovative things around assessment. There's a demonstration authority created in the law for states to work with districts to pilot innovative assessments that would ultimately become part of or replace elements of the statewide assessment system. And there's also funding available for states that wish to pursue it to conduct audits or reviews and develop plans with districts to improve assessment systems that could, in fact, get at things like those portfolio and project and performance task type assessments and help states begin to integrate those into systems. And then lastly on assessment, states may also, under the law, set a target limit on the amount of percentage of instructional time devoted to assessment. So that's a state option, not required by the law. And then as we shift gears to accountability, of course, we're not dealing with an entirely clean slate here. Just as No Child Left Behind put a significant amount of weight on statewide assessments, those tests do remain a core part of ESSA accountability. But the good news is Congress has broadened the range of indicators and included a lot of room for state discretion, working with local districts to determine what should go into the accountability system. So at a minimum, ESSA requires each state's accountability system to have its indicators, those statewide assessments that I mentioned in English, language arts, math, and science. And for the high school grades, those could include measures of student growth. In addition, for high schools, the grad rate has to be included. For elementary and middle schools, the state has to designate an additional or other academic indicator. And for elementary and middle, that could be a growth measure. As I mentioned earlier, English language proficiency also now moves up and is a core part of accountability. So the state's English language proficiency exam and the state's established targets for student performance on those exams is part of accountability. And then lastly, in what's been called by a lot of people the kind of fifth indicator, state systems must have at least one indicator of school quality or student success. So that opens up a whole range of options for what states could factor into accountability. I'm going to shift in just a second and talk about how those measures then are weighted and combined. But one other note on the indicators, you'll notice that 95% test participation isn't the kind of all or nothing indicator that it was under No Child Left Behind, but it remains part of the law. In fact, states are required to address in their state plans how the 95% test participation requirement will be factored into the state's accountability system. So this slide I won't talk about it in detail. It just kind of summarizes what I've said in terms of those goal areas and some of the restrictions on them. So then once the state has decided which indicators to use for its system and set goals and targets for each of them, the state must then have a plan for annual meaningful differentiation. So this kind of takes the place of AYP, if you will. How does the state use those measures, goals, and targets to identify schools that need support and improvement? So the state must design a plan to make this kind of differentiation on an annual basis, and then must weight those indicators according to some parameters established in the law. So there must be at least 3 performance levels set for each indicator, and then when those indicators are combined, those academic indicators must, and I'm going to switch to my graphic on that. So the academic indicators of academic achievement, growth or another academic indicator, grad rate, and progress in English language proficiency. Those are those boxes on the right-hand side of the scale. Independently, each of those must have substantial weight in the accountability system. When they're combined, they must have much greater weight than the left side of the scale, which is that measure or measures of school quality and student success. And so the law doesn't define with specificity the weights, but it does define how a state would know or be able to demonstrate that it's met these targets of substantial weight and much greater weight. From that, then, states are to identify at least 2 categories of schools. And I should note here, in between this differentiation and identification, the department has out a notice of proposed rulemaking around accountability and state plans. And in that notice requires, as you're probably well aware in the California context, that notice would require, if it becomes final regulation, that states have a single summative rating. So that's not spelled out in the law, but the department is proposing so that once the state weights each of those indicators, that a state would have to assign a single rating. Could be a letter grade, could be a numerical index, could be some sort of label. So that's a possibility that would have to be added into the system as well. But at a minimum, states then have to identify at least 2 categories of schools. And within those 2 categories, there are a few ways the school could be identified. So comprehensive support and improvement, that's roughly the equivalent of the priority schools that states have had to identify under No Child Left Behind waivers. But within that category are the lowest performing 5% of Title I schools. Any high school, again, not just Title I, any high school that has a grad rate below 67%, and any school with a chronically low-performing subgroup. And I'm going to talk in just a minute about what, how a state would define chronically low-performing subgroup. The second category is targeted support and improvement. And this is kind of like the focus schools under the waiver, where there may not be systemic school-wide issues. They're really trying to address the issue where there is a single subgroup or multiple subgroups that have performance issues. So in that category, a state would identify any school with a low-performing subgroup and any school with a consistently low-performing subgroup. Let me say just a bit more about those. So in this slide, above the red line are those comprehensive support and improvement. Again, the lowest performing 5% of Title I schools, and the state can use an average over not more than 3 years, low grad rate, and then the chronically low-performing subgroup. But to understand chronically low-performing subgroups, let me explain what is a low-performing subgroup first. So the law says the state has to identify as low-performing any school in which one or more subgroups has performance that is at or below the level of all of the students performing, or all of the students in any of the lowest 5% of Title I schools. So on its face, this looks pretty convoluted, but really you look at your lowest 5% of Title I schools, and then you compare student subgroup performance in other schools to that lowest 5% bar. And if a school has a single subgroup or more subgroups that would essentially put them in that low-performing category on their own, they have to be identified as low-performing. If those schools don't improve within 3 years or a shorter time frame established by the state, then they have to be bumped up to comprehensive support and improvement. And just a quick note or two on what these categories then mean, because this is another area where ESSA is a major departure from No Child Left Behind. So under No Child Left Behind, when a state was identifying a school for improvement or corrective action or restructuring, there were very prescriptive things that a state had to ensure happened working with that school's district leaders, including offering public school choice and supplemental services, withholding 5% of Title I funds to be used for improvement. And as the school progressed on that trajectory of improvement, even up to eventually those kind of turnaround models defined in the School Improvement Grant Program. All of those are gone under ESSA. For both targeted support and improvement schools and comprehensive support and improvement schools, the bottom line is it's the district's responsibility, working with the school or them working together, to identify the right evidence-based interventions. And those would be identified based on a needs assessment that's conducted at the school level. And then those interventions are incorporated into an improvement plan. For those targeted support schools, the district, the LEA, has to approve that plan and monitor its implementation. For a comprehensive support and improvement school, the district, and then ultimately the state has to approve the plan and monitor it. And so then if, a targeted support and improvement school doesn't improve, as I said, if it's one of those lowest performing schools, it could move up to comprehensive. If a school in the comprehensive category doesn't meet state established exit criteria and state timelines that can be no more than 4 years, then the state ultimately has to step in and take more rigorous state-determined action. I mentioned the 95% test participation, so testing opt-out, parental opt-out, I know is a big issue in California, as it has been in some other states. The law does not prohibit parental opt-out, but still requires that states assess 95% of students and then incorporate that 95% participation rate into accountability. The department's proposed regulation would go further and require states to take action if a school doesn't meet the 95% target. And some of those actions that would potentially be required would be assigning that school a lower summative rating. So I mentioned that summative performance rating, assigning the school the lowest possible performance level on the academic achievement indicator, or taking some sort of other state-determined action that's equally rigorous. Title I also continues to provide funding for continuous improvement of schools, and there is grant funding. I won't go into a lot of detail given the amount of time we've got, but there are state grants, and the focus of those grants in terms of what passes through the districts, they can be formula or competitive, and they're primarily to be used for those two categories of schools of comprehensive and targeted. Right, I'm not going to touch on the state assessment grant, but let me hand it to you, Reg, just in the interest of time, to talk through some of the other big elements of the law.
Thank you, Amy, and good morning, everyone. Title II remains the primary home of the law's formula investment in capacity building for both classroom educators, but also, importantly, school leaders, and is much more than really any other title, a source of flexible support for building the capacities and skills in the professional workforce that will be needed to continue the work that you're leading at the district level, but also consistent with the state policies that will be developed as part of the consolidated state ESSA plan. And these investments are available for attracting, selecting, placing, supporting, and retaining educators. You can think about it across the continuum of the hiring process through senior leadership among your educators. Importantly, there are some key policy changes that were made as part of the new law. For example, No Child Left Behind's highly qualified teacher requirement has been eliminated. Notably, unlike the NTLB waiver framework established several years ago, there is not a requirement in exchange for taking Title II dollars to have educator evaluation systems in place. It's a permissible use for those funds, but not a mandate required in exchange for accepting these important formula dollars. We've talked a little bit about the important state planning process underway, and you'll hear more about that from Barbara momentarily. But Title II does also include an important planning process for districts as well that must include meaningful consultation with key stakeholders, including educators in the classroom, but also principals and others in developing that really important Title II plan. Lastly, I just want to highlight one additional significant change to the Title II funding formula. Under the new law, states are permitted to withhold an additional 3% of the traditional 95% provided to districts for state-level capacity building focused on school and district leaders. That investment may be made across a range of capacity building areas. At the discretion of the state, it's a relatively flexible investment. And Amy, if you don't mind, I'll now transition to Title III to keep us on track. As Amy mentioned, the traditional accountability requirements around English language proficiency have been moved from Title III into Title II, but the new Title III does continue the formula program investment in the supplemental services that focus on both English language proficiency, but also academic achievement of English learners, and states in their planning must establish and implement entrance and exit requirements for English learners. I think importantly for district leaders, the range of allowable uses of the formula program established by Title III are greater, and it's a more flexible source of funding now. We've highlighted a few of the new investments contemplated by the statute, including investments in preschool, which you'll also should know are embedded in many other parts of ESSA, offering early college, high school, and dual enrollment opportunities for English learners, and other opportunities for supplementing the initiative supporting these students. Lastly, I'll just say about Title III, there is a requirement for states to set goals around English language proficiency related to the new accountability system that Amy described earlier. Amy, if you don't mind, please transition to 4. And then We also want to mention the new Title IV of ESSA, which includes an important new block grant. In addition to the important policy provisions that Amy's already mentioned, one of the major changes that Congress undertook in the new law was to eliminate and consolidate a number of existing programs under No Child Left Behind. A number of those programs were swept into this new block grant in Title IV known as the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grant, which includes a three-part focus. What Congress calls a well-rounded education, sort of easiest to think of them as sort of enrichment activities, but there are a long line of examples included in the statute. The second big category Congress called conditions for learning. This is the kind of spiritual successor to the Safe and Drug-Free and Communities program, but with much fewer strings attached. And the last element of the new program is about the effective use of technology, and it includes a professional development focus around technology, but also a potential investment in actual technology and infrastructure required to deliver on the promises of the law. This is a new formula program that will be distributed consistent with the Title I formulas. Right now, Congress is in the sort of in a holding pattern, but when they return after the election, one of the important decisions that they will make before the end of the year is how much money to allocate for the U.S. Department of Education, including this program. We think it's probably going to be between $300 million and $1 billion in year one. I would call to your attention that the statute expressly permits districts to collectively apply to their states for this funding. If you have ideas for joint initiatives between districts, this is a great opportunity to try to maximize the amount of money that's allocated to you on a district-by-district basis and really magnify it by working together. 95% of these dollars do flow down to the district level. For those schools that receive more than, or those districts that receive more than $30,000 under the formula, you do have to conduct a needs assessment similar to the needs assessment that is required in other provisions of ESSA, including the school turnaround provisions that Amy just described. And we're encouraging leaders to be very thoughtful about how that needs assessment is conducted. Lastly, because I know we need to turn to the state conversation, the state planning process is expected to continue through the end of the year and into early 2017. In the meantime, the U.S. Department of Education will continue to publish non-regulatory guidance, but also complete work on the important pending rulemaking proceedings, including the accountability assessment and supplement not supplant rulemakings that are open. Just speeding through these elements to keep us on track, but know that in the coming weeks we should first see the final rule related to the accountability requirements, probably followed then in order by the academic assessment rulemaking, and probably not until into early next year the supplement not supplant requirements. That rulemaking is still open to public comment through November 7th. So I know we're a few minutes behind schedule, and we'll have time at the end, I think, for additional questions, but thank you for this opportunity to speak with you, and I'll pass the baton back to Martha to introduce Barbara and the California team. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy, for the overview. It's a lot of information from the more than 1,100 pages of the ESSA law. So we appreciate you providing those insights and the most important information our members need to know of. In the meantime, as Barbara gets ready the PowerPoint, for everyone else, if you have questions for Amy and Reg from a federal perspective, please type it into the chat box. If we don't have time to answer the questions today, we'll follow up with the participants after the webinar. So Barbara, we look look forward to hearing how this ties back into California's state plan and the opportunities to engage school leaders across the state in this work.
All right, thanks, Martha, and thanks to everyone at ACSA for inviting us to talk to you about what's going on with California and our response to the Every Student Succeeds Act. We're happy to be here this morning to provide you with updates and share with you ways that you can remain involved. We're going to just wait for the ball to be passed over to us. So while we're waiting, I'm not sure if you can see my screen or not, but we can get started with the presentation because the first slide is really asking you, what's the most important question you have regarding the Every Student Succeeds Act? You just heard a lot of information from Amy and Reg, who did just like a great job providing you with a crash course in the provisions in the law. But it's important for us here at the Department of Education to be able to understand really what your most burning questions are so that we can prioritize our technical assistance activities. So if you would, while we're waiting for my screen to be shared, go ahead and type your question, your most important question about ESSA, into the chat box.
Barbara, you're able to bring up your desktop. You're able to share now.
Go share. All right. All right. So I think it's really important that we contextualize the work ahead. California anticipates that we will be submitting our consolidated state plan for ESSA in July, and there's certainly a lot of work to do and a lot of decisions to be made between now and the July 3rd submission date. But I think it's really important for all Californians to understand and appreciate how much work we've already done towards addressing many of the ESSA requirements. We've been working really hard since 2010 to implement new standards and assessments, and we have come a long way and have gotten to a place where we're feeling pretty good about how that is going. So that's what we'll describe in our section of the plan that talks about standards and assessments. A few questions yet to be answered, but for the most part, we know what we're doing as Californians in response to standards and assessments. Similarly, there's a section of the plan that asks us to describe our activities around supporting excellent educators. We have many decisions yet to be made around resources and how we allocate them, but at the same time, we have this amazing roadmap, Greatness by Design, I'm sure most of you are familiar with, that really talks about the state's vision for how we support educators from recruitment all the way up through retirement. So that will be our roadmap when we describe what it is that we're doing in terms of supporting educators throughout their careers. Similarly, for accountability, California for the last 3 years plus has been working on an entirely new accountability system, our local control funding formula, with those 8 state priorities, with our new evaluation rubrics that the board approved last month, really are our accountability system, and ESSA allows us to have that single accountability system. So I think I think it's just important for us to all realize that many of these pieces that will need to be described in our state plan are pieces that California has been working on for a number of years. So when the plan was signed, when the law was signed back in December, and the state board was in the midst of working with California stakeholders to develop those evaluation rubrics, although it was like, whoa, we've got a whole new thing we've got to look at, it very quickly became clear that that whole new thing was an opportunity to integrate the federal requirements into the work already underway, and that ESSA really presented the state with the opportunity to create a single, coherent, local, state, and federal accountability and a continuous improvement system that's aligned with California's priorities. So it's extra work, but it's actually great work in that by the time we are done with our ESSA Consolidated State Plan, we will have a single system, not one federal system on one side and a state and local system on another side, not AYP on one hand and API on the other hand. We will have a single coherent system, and folks are feeling really pretty great about that opportunity. Really important to note, most of the provisions of ESSA will not go into effect until the 17-18 school year. So here at the ESSA office at the Department of Education, we are tasked with developing a state plan, and our state plan requirements are listed on the screen. They have been talked through with Amy and Reg, but for the most part, there are 6 major sections of the plan where we're asked to respond to the federal requirements. I won't go through every one, but you can see most of I will go through them in the upcoming slides. Very important to note that these plan requirements are in the proposed regs, and it is possible that they may change a little as we see the final regs. Once we submit the plan, ED has 120 days to either accept the plan and approve it or to return it to us and say they need more research or something that shows that we need to do something else to meet the requirements. So the first section, or the second section of the plan, is consultation and coordination. You can see on the screen all of the folks that we are required to consult with as we develop the plan, and we'll talk a little bit more about how you can be engaged in the ongoing development of the plan. And we do have a formal body here in California, the California Practitioners Advisory Group, a great group of 17 people appointed by the state board to provide feedback on the emerging accountability system and serve as our Title I Committee of Practitioners. They meet pretty regularly, and it's a great opportunity to kind of preview some of the big decisions that will be coming to the board each time. Their next meeting will be December 7th. So they see sections of the plan or the elements of the plan the month before those elements are brought to the board, and all of their meetings are webcast, and those webcasts are archived so you can enjoy them at your leisure. Kind of a common sense requirement, the plan requires that we coordinate our ESSA State Plan with all of our other federal programs, and that work is underway here at the department, making sure that leads for all these programs are well apprised of what's going on and can alert us to any inconsistencies. Also, they will be working with their counterparts at more local levels to make sure that everyone understands what's happening with ESSA and how it fits with these other programs. Again, coherence is what we're aiming for. I won't spend much time here. I think Reg and Amy did a great job summarizing the requirements for academic standards and academic assessments. Again, just a couple of things that the board will need to decide on, like how are we going to deal with less than 95% participation rate, small-ish kinds of things. But, you know, we've talked to a lot of other states, and some of them are still really struggling with, you know, what will their standards be next year, what assessments will they be using next year, and California is in pretty good shape in terms of describing its standards and assessment system. Accountability, support, and improvement for schools. So in this section of the plan, we'll need to describe our accountability system. For those of you who have been paying close attention to board meetings, and maybe some of you who even don't pay close attention to board meetings, you know last month our state board did approve the evaluation rubrics, and in those rubrics, those indicators were chosen because they could actually meet the federal requirements. So our accountability system right now, other than a couple of pesky items in the proposed regulations, I think Reg referred to the summative rating requirement that's in regs but not in statute. For the most part, our accountability system is consistent with federal requirements right now. In terms of identification of schools and who will those comprehensive and targeted support schools be, and what will the support and improvements for those schools look like, those are elements that have yet to be decided. So those are decisions that will be brought to the board in the coming months. For those of you who are familiar with the Educator Equity Plan that California submitted to ED last year, all of those provisions, that Educator Equity Plan has been incorporated into the ESSA Consolidated State Plan. In addition, in this section of the plan, we will need to describe what our systems for educator development, retention, and advancement, how do we certify and license and prepare our teachers, what kinds of professional growth opportunities are there. And again, our colleagues at the Commission on Teacher Credentialing and here at the department have been working pretty hard since 2012 to implement the recommendations laid out by the Educator Excellence Task Force in Greatness by Design. So a couple of smallish requirements have yet, we'll need to make some decisions around what that looks like, but again, the hard work that we've all been doing for the last 5 or 6 years puts us in pretty good shape in terms of the plan. But Reg did describe there is an optional 3% set aside in Title II, so typically 95% of the state's Title II allocation goes down to LEAs for use at the local level, but there is in ESSA a 3% Title II Part A optional set-aside of the LEA subgrant allocation that states can use to build capacity of principals and other school leaders. So although we are up against a tight timeline here, I would very much appreciate, because this is something that our state board is looking at very closely, thinking about holding back that 3%. What types of supports do you think are most needed by principals and other school leaders? So again, this hasn't been decided yet, but certainly as the implementation of state standards has been rolling out over the last few years, we do have some evidence that additional supports for school administrators to provide the kinds of instructional leadership required might be a good investment. So please do take a minute and type your response in the chat box. If the state board were to pursue this option, what might that look like? Just from your perspective, what kinds of supports would be most needed? So the final section of the plan, and please do continue to type that in the chat box while I keep going in the interest of time. The final section of the plan is supporting all students, and in this section we will talk about how we make sure as a state that we're providing equitable access to well-rounded and supportive education for all of our students, and talk about our performance management and technical assistance systems. How are we managing our own performance at the state level in how we're supporting folks, and how are we supporting LEAs and schools to be the best that they can be on behalf of our students. And we have to work that out in terms of California's response. We do have a system built from NCLB, and we've had an NCLB state plan since 2002. It's 15 years. The state is looking closely at ways that we as a state can really focus on the capacity building and continuous improvement part of accountability and continuous improvement so that we make sure that folks have what they need to do the best they can by our students. Also in this section of the plan, we'll need to address a number of program-specific requirements, our school-wide programs, education of migratory students, English learners, rural and low-income schools, and how we are supporting our homeless children and youth. So those are the sections of the plan, and here on this slide you can see our plan development timeline. For those of you who have been following this, you know that this timeline has changed a little bit in the last few months. Part of that is we do not have any final regulations yet. We anticipate that we will be getting final regulations on accountability data reporting and state plans, final regulations on assessment, final regulations on supplement, not supplant, sometime before our colleagues back in Washington have a new administration, but we don't have them yet. And although we had anticipated and really wanted to have the plan rolled out and finalized before the beginning of the 17-18 school year when it is supposed to go into effect, we can't craft a final plan and put it out for the required 30-day public comment period in the absence of final regulations. So, given that that's where we stand right now, we have decided to roll out the plan in 3 successive drafts with more information coming to the board each time over the next 3 board meetings. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's coming when on the next slide. But we anticipate that we will have all of the final regulations we need to inform a final draft of the plan and be able to present that plan to the board in March and then put it out for the required 30-day public comment period. And then the board will take into account public comment at its May meeting, and the plan will be submitted to ED in July. So it's important to note that this timeline could change again depending on what happens with ED and the regulations they put forth, and also, of course, pending any board feedback. But with this rollout, this 3 successive draft rollout in mind, we will be seeing very shortly, in fact, we anticipate it'll be posted on Friday, the first draft of the ESSA State Plan will be available at the November board meeting. And that first draft will include the sections on this screen. So we'll have our summary of consultation and coordination. We'll explain challenging academic standards and academic assessments. What are we doing? These are elements that we don't really need a whole lot of regulations to describe. We'll also include sections on those program-specific requirements I alluded to earlier. And then additional sections will come out in January and March. So some of the ones that the board has not yet decided, long-term goals and measures of interim progress. We know what we're doing with accountability, but we haven't yet tackled the support and improvement for schools, supporting excellent educators, supporting all students, and again, that performance management and technical assistance. Information, California's response to those requirements will be made available in January and March. So each time we have a draft, we're going to do our best to encourage all California stakeholders, including all of you here on this webinar, to review and provide feedback on each one of those drafts. So every time we have a draft, about a week after the board meeting, we will release and make available a set of tools. We'll have a webinar, there'll be a survey available, and then, based on our first stakeholder outreach, we heard from folks that they would really like a toolkit for local use. You know, obviously, CDE staff can't be everywhere conducting stakeholder engagement activities, and lots of folks felt like they'd want to engage their communities in those kinds of activities. So we are going to put forth a toolkit each time that has narrated PowerPoints that walk people through the sections of the plan, and links to the survey, because we really need to hear from everyone about whether or not they think the plan is on track. Then in March, we will make available for that 30-day public comment period, again, the toolkit for local use, webinar, survey, and we will also do a more concerted push and do some statewide regional meetings as we did for our first outreach efforts. So by now you're probably wondering, how am I going to stay in the loop over the next 6 months? Sounds like a lot is happening. So on this screenshot, you can see our ESSA webpage here at the department, and most everything you need is available here on this webpage. The first most important link, in my humble opinion, is that link to join the ESSA listserv. So if you go to our ESSA webpage, you just click that link and you are officially signed up. There are a few things that have changed for 16-17, and those things were included in the 2016-17 transition plan. That's the second link on the page, a great reference if you're wondering, well, what are we doing now that HQT is gone or now that supplemental educational services are gone? If you go further down that list of useful links, you can see the California Practitioners Advisory Group. Again, a great way to preview many of the items that are coming to the board. The Practitioners Advisory Group has a chance to provide feedback on the elements and the items that are coming to the board a month before they come to the board. So it's a great way to stay in the loop. And further down the page, you'll see there are lots of links to resources from ED, including all of the guidance that ED has made available. They've done a great job releasing guidance this year, guidance on Title II, Title III, foster youth, homeless students, lots of other guidance that you can't see on this screenshot, but that's on the page, and also links to all those proposed regulations. So, big push, please do join the ESSA listserv. A lot will be happening relatively quickly in the next 6 months, and we need you to participate so that we have the best possible plan that represents what we as Californians would like to see. It's not a CDE plan, it is a California plan. If you have questions and comments, and I'm sure you will have many, please do send them to this dedicated mailbox, essa@cde.ca.gov, and there's a direct link to the web page. So we encourage you to get involved if you're not already involved, and stay involved. Again, we will have a final plan in May, and we had our No Child Left Behind plan in effect basically for 15 years. So we think of this next 6 months as like a critical time for folks to make that investment of time to make sure that we have a plan that we all feel good about when we're done writing it. So as I'm handing the ball back over to our colleagues at ACSA, and again, thanks to them for inviting us to participate this morning, do jot down, you know, we're already getting started getting your input. Do jot down in the chat box what is the most important thing that you would like to see in the ESSA State Plan.
Thank you, Barbara. Am I on? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Barbara. So we did have a question from the audience regarding assessments for continuation schools or alternative schools. I don't have the question in front of me, but it's on the chat box. Do you have a response to that question?
I don't have the question in front of me either.
Let me look for it, and let me tell you in a minute. Or, I don't think it got answered quite yet, so we thought, I don't think there's a response to it, but just wanted to make sure that if there's any other questions, we can help answer them.
So my understanding is that all students will be participating in the CASP assessment system. So whether you're in an alternative school or not, you will be participating in the CASP system. All but 1% of the kids with the most significant cognitive disabilities will be participating in the Smarter Balance test. So again, that's the information I have without actually having the question in front of me. But yes, Great. If you're an alternative school, you will still be taking the Smarter Balance test unless you are in that very small group of students with the most severe cognitive disabilities.
Thank you. And I think most of the feedback that we're getting is in responding to your questions from the prior slides. I don't think I see any more questions at this point. But for those who are listening on the webinar, if you do have questions, especially after the webinar, you have Barbara's ESSA CDE email address from the prior screen. So you can share those questions with Barbara through the CDE email address, or also here at ACSA, so we can help provide that information to the Department of Education. But thank you to our speakers today for providing a wealth of information regarding what's happening at the federal level with the new law and how it ties back to California's work on the new accountability system. I think it was an hour well spent, so thank you to the three of you for taking the time to speak to our members today. Just a few slides to close off the webinar for this morning. As you know, we have been doing a few different webinars at ACSA over the past 3 months discussing the new accountability system. We had one in August about the new evaluation rubric. Last month in September, we had one about the new LCAP template, the draft template that'll be adopted by the board at the November board meeting. And then our last webinar for the series for the time being will be on Thursday, November 17th at 9 a.m. This will be in collaboration with the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. Please feel free to sign up on our website, ACSA.org/webinars. The other two webinars that we have had, and the one from today as well, will be available for any of you that may want to watch them after the fact, since you have these first couple of ones. They're also available on the website. So with that, I'll mention there's also an opportunity, one last announcement. If I could go to the prior slide. There will be an opportunity for any of you that might be interested in getting additional information about the new evaluation rubrics and how they tie into the LCAP annual process, and how to look into your data, student performance information, and thinking about goal setting and the 3-year LCAP plan. There'll be these free trainings by the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. ACSA staff has been involved in these discussions. As you see on the screen, there's about 9 workshops throughout the state starting November 2nd. They're free for you to participate. There's information on the screen for you to sign up. And we've heard there's a lot of attendance from school board members, administrators. This will be a great opportunity for you to learn more information. It's open to the public, your parents, teachers, and others in your community. So please feel free to use this opportunity to engage with the state and ACSA. We have also, lastly, the last slide, our contact information at ACSA. My colleague Laura Preston, who has been helping to field the questions today, she helps with the federal advocacy as well as many other topics here at the state legislature. And we've been collaborating on the work between the federal advocacy with ESSA as well as here in California with the new state plan. I'll give a kudos to Laura because through her advocacy at the federal level and the support from Amy and Resh, ACSA was successful in trying to expand the use of Title II funds to include other school leaders, not just principals, so much more broader administrators in California, and that was through ACSA's direct advocacy and the support from our federal advocates. So with that, we appreciate you joining